When a healed empath meets a narcissist, again, this happens. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, observing a master chess player. Across the board, an opponent moves aggressively, taking pieces with loud intensity, attempting to induce panic, dictate the tempo, and force a blunder. Calm. In the past, the player on the receiving end would have flinched. Their pulse would race, their heart rate would spike, and their cognition would narrow into self-preservation. Reflective. They would over-explain every move, apologize for space they had every right to occupy, and sacrifice their own position just to keep the game peaceful. Now, imagine that same room years later. The same opponent returns, employing the exact same aggressive maneuvers, expecting the exact same emotional yield, but the dynamic has fundamentally shifted. The player across the table sits completely composed. Their breathing remains steady. Their heart rate barely shifts. They do not react. They simply observe. When the opponent tries to provoke them, the strike hits nothing but open air. What changed? The board didn't change. The opponent's strategy didn't change. What changed was the internal emotional architecture of the person sitting across from them. In human relationships, few dynamics are as intense or revealing as the interaction between an empathetic individual and a person driven by deep narcissistic traits. For years, we have analyzed this interaction through the lens of vulnerability, how open hearts can be manipulated, how emotional sensitivity can be exploited, and how boundary lines erode under persistent pressure. But what happens when the story doesn't end in exhaustion? What happens when an empathetic person goes through the laborious, intentional work of emotional healing? What happens when they rebuild their neural pathways, strengthen their self-awareness, and return to the very dynamic that once disarmed them? When a healed empath encounters a narcissist again, the entire social and emotional equation flips. It is no longer a story of survival. It becomes a textbook study in emotional intelligence, self-regulation, and the quiet power of internal clarity. If you stick with me through this speech, you will understand not just how this dynamic shifts, but the precise psychological mechanisms behind it. How neural self-regulation neutralizes manipulation, why calm neutrality starves toxic control, and how you can apply these exact emotional frameworks to protect your own mental focus in every relationship you enter. An unhealed empath reacts with panic and self-doubt, while a healed empath operates from emotional self-regulation, severing the narcissist's psychological leverage. High emotional self-awareness allows the healed empath to recognize projection in real time, transforming emotional hooks into neutral data. Boundaries transition from emotional, defensive battles into calm, non-negotiable operational rules. Narcissistic dynamic thrives on emotional reactivity. When met with calm composure, the feedback loop collapses entirely. Real resilience is rooted in deep self-compassion, preventing external validation or criticism from dictating internal self-worth. When an unhealed empath encounters a narcissist, the interaction triggers a predictable physiological storm. The moment a subtle insult, a projection, or a passive-aggressive shift in tone is deployed, the unhealed individual's brain registers an immediate threat to connection. The amygdala fires, releasing a cascade of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline that flood the nervous system. The heart rate accelerates, breathing becomes shallow, and executive functioning in the prefrontal cortex begins to dim. In this heightened state of survival, the empath falls into a familiar neurobiological trap, the trigger loop. They feel an urgent, almost compulsive need to explain themselves, clear up misunderstandings, defend their integrity, or soothe the agitator to regain a sense of safety. The narcissist relies precisely on this biological hijacking. Every frantic defense, every trembling explanation, and every tearful bid for fairness serves as emotional feedback, a clear sign that they hold the steering wheel of the other person's internal experience. This feedback loop creates a deep power asymmetry, reinforcing the narcissist's sense of control while leaving the empath emotionally depleted, hypervigilant, and thoroughly trapped in self-doubt. When the empath undergoes the intentional work of emotional healing, this fundamental physiological mechanism is rewritten. Healing is not merely a cognitive change of perspective, it is a profound restructuring of the nervous system's baseline. A healed empath has spent time building robust self-awareness and learning the art of somatic self-regulation. Through practices that strengthen the vagal tone, increase heart rate variability, and enhance emotional regulation, they train their body to process provocative social cues without immediately slipping into a fight or flight response. When they encounter the narcissist again, the exact same psychological maneuvers are deployed. The strategic side comments, the false narratives, the manufactured urgency. Yet, this time, the sensory input lands on an entirely different neural landscape. Instead of triggering an amygdala hijack, the provocation is intercepted by an active, well-regulated prefrontal cortex. The healed empath experiences the moment with cognitive clarity rather than physiological panic. Their pulse remains steady, their breathing stays deep, and their body does not register another person's emotional volatility as an existential emergency. They can observe the narcissist's behavior with the objective detachment of a scientist analyzing a predictable pattern. They recognize that the provocation is not a reflection of their worth, but an external, habituated bid for control. Because the physical impulse to fight, plead, or fix is absent, the emotional reaction never materializes. This shift completely severs the narcissist's leverage. Narcissistic influence depends entirely on the target's emotional reactivity. Without a reaction, the manipulation lacks a tether. When the expected storm of defensiveness or distress meets a wall of calm composure, the functional mechanics of the interaction collapse. The narcissist's psychological tactics hit an absolute vacuum. The healed empath does not need to raise their voice, win an argument, or deliver a crushing retort to prevail. By simply maintaining their internal equilibrium, they dismantle the entire dynamic, proving that true authority over one's life begins with the quiet mastery of one's own nervous system. In the architecture of emotional intelligence, self-awareness serves as the primary lens through which all incoming relational data is processed. When self-awareness is underdeveloped or obscured by past conditioning, an individual becomes exceptionally vulnerable to psychological projection. In a standard narcissistic dynamic, projection is the primary defense mechanism used to maintain a fragile, inflated sense of self. The narcissistic individual disowns their own unacknowledged flaws, insecurities, shame, and hostility, assigning these uncomfortable traits onto the person across from them. To an unhealed target, these projections act like toxic hooks. When told they are selfish, overly sensitive, irrational, or malicious, an individual lacking grounded self-knowledge pauses and absorbs the accusation. They look inward through a lens of doubt, asking themselves if the accusation might be true, and instantly begin working to disprove the false claim. This creates an exhausting cycle where the target spends vast amounts of psychological energy managing an identity that was fabricated entirely by someone else's internal distress. The transition from an unhealed state to emotional wholeness fundamentally alters how this incoming information is filtered. A healed empath has engaged in rigorous, honest self-assessment. They have mapped their own psychological terrain, developing a precise understanding of their actual strengths, real limitations, moral values, and emotional blind spots. Because their self-concept is built on accurate self-appraisal rather than external approval, it becomes anchored and resilient. When this individual encounters a narcissist again, the process of projection encounters a completely transformed cognitive barrier. High emotional self-awareness allows the healed individual to evaluate external statements against their own internal reality in real time, executing what can be understood as an immediate psychological audit. When the narcissist attempts to utilize projection, framing the healed empath as uncooperative, cruel, or incompetent, the statement does not penetrate the empath's self-concept. Instead of triggering an emotional collapse or a defensive argument, the projection is instantly recognized as secondary data. The healed empath does not ask, "Why are they saying this about me?" but rather observes, "What does this statement reveal about the speaker's internal state?" The insult or accusation loses its ability to wound because it is no longer misconstrued as an accurate evaluation of character. It is recognized precisely for what it is, an attempt by the speaker to externalize their own unmanageable internal discomfort. This perceptual shift transforms what used to be deeply painful emotional attacks into neutral, objective data points. The emotional hooks simply fail to catch because there is no unexamined self-doubt for them to snag upon. The healed empath no longer feels a cognitive or emotional obligation to correct the false narrative, defend their reputation within that conversation, or persuade the narcissist of the truth. They understand that trying to debate a projection is as futile as arguing with a shadow. By viewing the interaction through the lens of objective emotional awareness, the hostility loses its weight, the dramatic tension dissolves, and the healed individual remains fully intact, grounded in their own unshakable reality, while allowing the other person's projection to remain entirely with its owner. In relational dynamics, boundaries are frequently misunderstood as tools of confrontation. For an unhealed individual, setting a boundary is often an agonizing, high-friction event. It involves loud declarations, lengthy explanations, intense emotional buildup, and a desperate effort to make the other person understand, validate, or respect the line being drawn. When dealing with a narcissistic personality, these high-emotion boundaries invariably fail. The narcissist views emotional defensiveness as an invitation to negotiate, debate, or escalate the conflict. To them, a boundary declared with anger or anxiety signals that the line is fragile, driven by insecurity, and susceptible to pressure. The unhealed target ends up trapped in a perpetual state of perimeter defense, expending tremendous energy trying to build walls out of words, only to watch those walls crumble under the weight of persistent manipulation, guilt-tripping, or gaslighting. The evolution into emotional maturity changes the fundamental structural physics of how boundaries are conceptualized and deployed. A healed empath no longer views a boundary as a defensive weapon designed to change someone else's behavior. Rather, they understand a boundary as a quiet, internal operational rule designed to govern their own choices and energy. This shift moves the boundary from an external argument into an absolute, non-negotiable reality. The quiet wall requires no emotional theatricality, no raised voices, and no elaborate justifications. It is built not out of anger, but out of absolute self-respect and emotional clarity. When the healed empath encounters the narcissist again, they do not enter the room bracing for a battle. They enter with their internal rules already firmly established, tested, and sealed. When the narcissist inevitably attempts to test these perimeters, pushing for unearned intimacy, demanding inappropriate favors, or invading personal space, the response they encounter is shockingly devoid of friction. The healed empath does not engage in the exhausting practice of over-explaining why the boundary exists. They recognize that explaining a boundary to someone who intentionally seeks to cross it is merely providing them with raw material for a counter-argument. Instead, the boundary is delivered with calm, neutral brevity. Simple, declarative statements replace defensive speeches. Terms like, "That does not work for me," "I am not open to discussing this," or "If this conversation continues in this tone, I will step away," are delivered with the steady tone of someone stating, an unalterable law of nature. What makes these quiet walls impenetrable is the complete absence of emotional reactivity backing them. A boundary that is stated calmly and followed by immediate, consistent action eliminates all room for psychological leverage. If the narcissist attempts to argue, guilt, or mock the boundary, the healed empath does not rise to the bait. They do not re-explain, re-justify, or enter a debate. They simply execute the consequence quietly by ending the call, leaving the room, or shifting their attention elsewhere. The wall is not built out of spite or a desire to punish. It is simply a structural reality of the relationship. Through this quiet enforcement, the healed individual demonstrates that their personal peace is an absolute, non-negotiable asset, rendering all external attempts at boundary violation completely ineffective. To comprehend why a narcissist suffers a complete systemic breakdown when interacting with a healed empath, one must understand the psychological concept of narcissistic supply. At its core, a narcissistic personality structure is built around a fragile, hollow core that cannot produce its own genuine sense of self-worth or internal regulation. To survive, the individual relies entirely on external validation, attention, dominance, and emotional impact. This external input is not merely desired, it functions as a psychological life support system. Crucially, narcissistic supply does not require positive admiration. Negative emotional reactions, fear, panic, tears, defensiveness, rage, and desperate bids for approval are equally, if not more, satisfying. A strong emotional reaction from another human being serves as concrete proof of power. It demonstrates that the narcissist has successfully invaded another person's inner world, dictated their emotional state, and reshaped their reality. In the past, the unhealed empath served as an abundant source of this supply. Because their empathy lacked boundary awareness, their internal mirror neuron system over-indexed on the narcissist's mood. When the narcissist initiated a provocation, the unhealed empath reacted instantly with visible distress, over-explaining, apologizing, or matching the rising conflict with anxious energy. This frantic reactivity provided the exact psychological fuel the narcissist required, validating their sense of control while relieving their own internal discomfort. When the healed empath encounters the narcissist again, the supply chain is abruptly and entirely severed. The healed empath operates from a state of emotional self-regulation and intentional neutrality, often referred to in psychological terms as the gray rock approach, but elevated to a deep, genuine internal state rather than a performative act. When the narcissist deploys their usual suite of tactics, provocative baiting, passive-aggressive digs, dramatic shifts in warmth, or revisionist history, the input meets a complete absence of emotional resonance. The healed empath does not gasp, shrink, defend, counterattack, or seek to set the record straight. Their facial expressions remain calm, their vocal tone remains level, and their body language stays entirely relaxed. This absolute lack of emotional reactivity triggers a profound crisis in the narcissistic dynamic. Without emotional feedback, the narcissist experiences a psychological void. The bait was taken, but no line tightened. The strike was made, but it met no resistance. The narcissist's behavior relies on an action-reaction feedback loop to sustain itself. When the reaction is replaced by cold, polite, unimpressed neutrality, the feedback loop completely collapses. The narcissist is denied both the gratification of control and the ability to externalize their inner turmoil onto someone else. Faced with this sudden loss of supply, the narcissist's behavioral script falters. They may temporarily escalate their attempts, trying sharper insults or bigger grand gestures to elicit a spark of the old reactivity. However, as the healed empath maintains their unshakable composure, the futility of the effort becomes undeniable. The dynamic dies from simple starvation. The narcissist, unable to extract the emotional fuel required to sustain their illusion of dominance, is left facing the silence of their own unintegrated insecurities, forced to either retreat entirely or seek an easier target elsewhere. At the foundational level of human psychology, the mechanisms of emotional resilience are directly determined by the source from which an individual draws their intrinsic worth. An unhealed empath often operates under a precarious emotional architecture where external validation serves as the primary pillar of self-esteem. Because their deep sensitivity compels them to care profoundly about the experiences and perceptions of others, they inadvertently allow external opinions to dictate their internal value. When targeted by a narcissist, this vulnerability becomes catastrophic. The narcissist's weapons, invalidation, harsh criticism, gaslighting, and sudden withdrawal of affection, act as direct strikes against the empath's delicate sense of self. Without a strong internal cushion of self-compassion, every external critique registers as an undeniable truth or a terrifying threat to their belonging, forcing the empath into endless loops of self-doubt and anxious overcompensation to regain approval. The true breakthrough in an empath's healing journey occurs when they transition from seeking external approval to cultivating deep, unconditional self-compassion. Self-compassion is not merely self-care or superficial positive thinking. It is a neurobiologically active practice that rewires how the brain responds to stress, failure, and hostility. By learning to treat oneself with warmth, understanding, and non-judgmental acceptance during moments of distress, the healed empath creates an internal emotional sanctuary. They develop an unshakable core identity anchored in self-knowledge, self-respect, and self-forgiveness. When this internal shield is fully established, the power dynamics of external judgment undergo a permanent shift. When the healed empath re-enters the presence of a narcissist, this shield of self-compassion alters how incoming emotional attacks are processed. The narcissist relies heavily on exploiting self-doubt, aiming to make the victim feel fundamentally flawed, unworthy, or crazy. However, when these toxic arrows are fired at a person anchored in self-compassion, they hit an impenetrable barrier. The healed empath does not look to the narcissist or anyone else to confirm their goodness, intelligence, or sanity. Because they have already provided that safety to themselves internally, the narcissist's judgments lose all operational weight. Criticisms that once caused weeks of agonizing rumination are now seen as irrelevant, subjective noise belonging entirely to the person expressing them. This emotional shield functions not by building a hard, cynical shell, but by maintaining a soft heart backed by absolute self-preservation. Self-compassion allows the healed empath to acknowledge their own imperfections without feeling destroyed by them, rendering the narcissist's attempts to use shame or guilt completely impotent. If a narcissist accuses them of being selfish for maintaining a healthy boundary, the self-compassionate individual internally validates their own right to peace, recognizing that self-care is not selfishness. They no longer feel an anxious impulse to modify their behavior, apologize for existing, or abandon their own needs to keep someone else comfortable. Ultimately, self-compassion secures the empath's internal sovereignty. It ensures that their emotional state is governed internally rather than externally outsourced. When an individual fully embraces their own worth, external malice, subtle manipulation, and toxic projections find no crack in the armor to penetrate, leaving the healed empath entirely secure, balanced, and free.